Hello. So what do we really know about this character witness in our trial of Jesus today? Judas Iscariot. We know that he's, son of Simon Iscariot. Know that he was one of the original 12 disciples. Know that he was the treasurer of the group, what John calls the holder of the money bag. I like that. Sounds like dads, often. Their kids, parents. We know that he betrayed Jesus with a kiss for 30 pieces of silver to the Sanhedrin. Now, even today, betrayed by a kiss is a thing 2,000 years later. That any time people talk about 30 pieces of silver, we all know what that means from that one financial transaction. But besides that, there's a whole lot more questions than answers when it comes to Judas, aren't there? Like even the name, not Judas itself, Judah or Judas. Judah in Hebrew, Judas in Greek and Latin was a very common name, first name for men back in those days. But that second name, Iscariot, they're not exactly sure. Many people think that Iscariot is the very literal Is, a man of, Keriot, Kerioth. There were two towns in Judea back in those times that were named Keriot and Kerioth, so that could have been it. Others say that he was part of a very famous band of assassins that were part of the rebel freedom-fighting crowd back in Palestine in those days, known as the Icaris. Could have been that that's what they're saying. If that's the case, it will inform a little bit about his motivation for betraying Jesus. Others notice that there is a resemblance between the Hebrew word for liar or false one and Iscariot. So some have said that maybe this name was actually a nickname that was given to Judas, sort of an epitaph that was given to him after the betrayal by the rest of the disciples, who called him Judas the liar or Judas the false one. That seems to work unless, of course, you realize that if that would mean that his dad was also Simon the liar, that would be really sad. We also aren't exactly sure about exactly precisely the way that he died. In Matthew, if you remember, he goes and he gives the 30 pieces of silver back to the priest and he goes and hangs himself. In the book of Acts, it says that he goes and throws himself head first over a cliff and that he hits and his bowels explode and go everywhere. Sorry to tell you that. It's called the Field of Blood, and it's still named that even today. I can get even more grisly to tell you that those biblical literalists who have a real tough time with any discrepancies in the Bible want to take those two stories and put them together so that neither one of them is wrong. So what they say is that Judas went and hung himself on the edge of a cliff, and that many days later, when his body had become bloated, it broke the rope, and then his body fell and it exploded in the ground. Really gross, sorry. But probably the biggest question of all that we have when it comes to Judas is, why did he do it? Was it simply for those 30 pieces of silver? Was it a greed thing, unadulterated greed, wanting to have that money? That comes into question, because if he was the treasurer of the group, and particularly as the Gospel of John says, if he was skimming money off the top, then actually that would just dry up his source of income, right? Others have often said that if he was, certainly if he was part of this Iscariot group, this group of assassins, if he was a freedom fighter, one of the rebels for the cause, it could have been that he got very disillusioned and upset with Jesus when he found out that the kind of kingdom that Jesus had come to bring was a peaceful one. That Judas had been expecting, along with many others, that he was going to be a military Messiah who was going to raise up an army and kick the Romans out once and for all and reestablish a political Davidic dynasty once again. Another theory along those same lines is that Judas was just trying to force Jesus' hand, that he never intended for Jesus to be killed, but he was sure that if he betrayed Jesus and if he got Jesus arrested, it would force Jesus to call in that legion of angels that he talks about, and the army would raise up and the fight would start and the revolution would be sparked, and that when he realized that that's not what was going to happen, he felt great remorse, which is why he gave back the money and went and killed himself. Or else, like they're going to talk about today in the trial, some have argued, based on that story of Mary using that jar of perfume, that expensive jar of perfume on Jesus' feet, and when Jesus didn't condemn Mary for that, that Judas, who had complained that this money could be used for the poor, maybe he, for the first time, realized that Jesus, who was always talking about the poor and oppressed, was actually more self-centered than he thought, that he was actually just another one of these power-hungry, self-centered despots. But whatever the reason, the one thing we're all in lockstep agreement about is that Judas was the most hated, reviled human being in all of human history. I mean, Genghis Khan, Saddam Hussein, they have nothing over what we think of Judas. He's become the man that we all love to hate. He's become the very icon, the archetype of what it means to be vile and sinister and deceitful and a betrayer. Isn't that right? It's amazing what you can learn on Google these days. I was looking at names, and I saw that in 1978, there were still 75,000 Adolfs living in our world. Most of them had been named before 1945, but still 75,000 nonetheless. And as of 2006, 1 in every 26,700 babies were still being named Adolf. Put that in contrast to the name Judas. How many Judases do you see running around? Pretty amazing, isn't it, that this name that was so popular before Judas Iscariot just completely disappeared off the map after he lived. For a faith that's based on someone who taught us about love and grace and forgiveness, we hold this curious resentment towards Judas, don't we? And it gets even more confusing when you stop to think about the theology behind it, because the reality is, if Judas hadn't done what he did, if he hadn't betrayed Christ, if Christ hadn't been arrested and crucified, it may have thrown God's entire plan for the salvation of humankind into jeopardy. Couldn't it have? In fact, it's interesting, the Gnostic theologians that were coming up around the time shortly after Christ, the Gnostic theologians, including their own version of the Gospels, the Gospel of Judas, tells the story in which Jesus and Judas actually come up with and plan out the betrayal together. They talk about Judas as the most important of all of the disciples. And of course, the Gnostics were seen as a heretical group, and they were condemned by the early church fathers, and the Gospel of Judas was seen as an apocryphal gospel. But there are still veins of that, even in the Gospels that we still have. And so throughout the Gospels, we see that they say that Satan entered Judas at the time when it was time for him to go and betray Jesus. Very reminiscent of the way that God hardens Pharaoh's heart during the Exodus, right? And even in the Gospel of John, Jesus turns to Judas and he says, what you must do, go and do it quickly. So the question is, was it even really Judas's fault? Or was he just a very important, integral plan, part of God's plan to save all of us? And even if it was Judas's fault, even if it was his own idea and his own doing and his own failings, maybe even the bigger question is, was this the one sin that God was not going to be able to forgive? I mean, if we believe that God says that wherever we go, there's nowhere we can run, there's nowhere we can hide where we can get away from God's Spirit, do we mean except for Judas? If God was able to forgive David, the king of Israel, for sleeping with his best friend's wife and then murdering his best friend to try to cover it up, if God could forgive Peter for denying that he even knew him, not just once, but 3 separate times on the night that Christ needed him most, if Paul was convinced that neither death nor life nor angels nor principalities nor darkness, nor things to come, nor present, nor anything in all of creation can separate us from the love of God which is in Jesus Christ our Lord, did he mean, oh, except for that guy Judas. Yes, Judas betrayed Jesus. Judas betrayed the most important person in the world to him. And yet how many times do we betray Christ in big and little ways, in our words and our actions and our deeds every day? And when we betray those around us, how often is it the people who are the most important people in the world to us? It was Dale Bruner, who's been here a few times, who I heard preach when I was at my church in Houston. He came down to preach to us. It was the first time that I heard someone say that perhaps Judas's greatest betrayal, or greatest sin, wasn't his betrayal of Christ. It was that he gave up on Christ too early. That in taking his own life, he was basically saying that he didn't believe that Christ could forgive him. He didn't have any hope that Christ could forgive him for the horrible thing that he had done. A few weeks ago, we were preaching on these great meals of the Bible, and we preached about this beautiful, powerful breakfast that Jesus prepares for Peter after his resurrection on the beach, where he fries up the fish, and he has this incredible conversation that's tailor-made to forgive Peter for exactly what he had been through. And he has this series of 3 questions and answers. Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Care for my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. And with each one of those questions and statements, it's like he's peeling back and forgiving another one of Peter's 3 denials. And the great unanswered question in the scriptures is, what would Judas's breakfast have looked like if he had stuck around long enough to have it? If Jesus could have gone from that breakfast with Peter to that breakfast with Judas, what kind of dramatic, powerful way would he have let Judas know that he truly is forgiven, that Jesus can trust in him again to reinstate him once again? There is a Celtic tale that comes out of Ireland about the day of the second coming, when all of the saints are together from all places and all times, together up in the new heaven, the new Jerusalem, celebrating and having a party in a giant circle, when all of a sudden they notice that there's one person missing. Jesus isn't there in the crowd, and they look and they see at the very periphery of heaven, Jesus standing there all by himself, quiet. And they yell out to him, Jesus, what are you doing? Come and join us, join the party. What are you doing? Very calmly, very quietly, Jesus just says, I'm waiting for Judas. Year by year, and day by day, moment by moment, may we become just that much more like our Master. Amen.